So this is now the third video, step 3, in the argument of why I have changed my position on the long ending of Mark, why I think the long ending, verses 9 to 20, were most likely original to the gospel. I'm not a textual critic, so you have to understand that I'm really doing my work on narrative criticism, and so I've presented the pathway that I myself actually have taken in changing my mind. I'm not trying to lay out a text critical argument in any kind of formal way, and you'll have to look to the textual critics in the end to see how they might respond or critique the argument I'm presenting here. I'm starting with the internal evidence first. We covered the structure of the whole gospel, as well as the arrangement of chapters 14 to 16, which is the final stage of the book, the sixth and final stage of the book, to look at how it's arranged and to show that the long ending is integral to that particular section. Just if you isolate it, it's integral to that section. So we had two different layers of evidence there in the first two videos, and now here in the third video we're going to look at the style, the literary style. In fact, if we just take a look here, you can see these will be the five things we cover. First, the narrative habit of the, I guess is one way to put it anyway, or narrative arranging instinct or telling instinct in one there. It's not too long; it'll be easier to show than to describe. And then we'll talk about the transition in verse 9, which is often described as disjunctive and abrupt, which is, I think, true. It is abrupt. And then in the third thing will be the thought flow of the whole of the long ending in relation to the other parts, the earlier parts of the story, particularly in verses 1 to 8, but still before that. And then we'll cover the vocab and syntax. Is it Markan or not? And then we'll cover any evidence that might be counter evidence against this way of concluding that the long ending is original to the gospel. So let's just look first of all at the structure of the book. Remind ourselves that there's 6 sections. It begins in Judea. Jesus is in Judea for his baptism, and then John is arrested and Jesus flees to Galilee. And he's in Galilee for much of the book in his ministry. Then in chapter 10, as we begin stage 5, he turns back toward Judea and Jerusalem, where we know he will face death and then be his resurrection and ascension. And so that's just kind of an overview. This is, let's just back up here. This section right here, stage 6, is what we're looking at here, right? Chapters 14 to 16, you can see that right there, chapters 14 to 16. And this is the what we covered in video 2, the 9 separate scenes in 3 parts. And the long ending, of course, is right here. And so one of the things that we need to look at is how this story is told. It's sort of narrative instinct. And then we'll go on to talk about how is it a natural transition from here to here? And actually, there's some things back here as well regarding Galilee. So how does that play out in this last section? So the thought flow there, and then eventually the vocab and the syntax. All right, so let's look at the opening question, which is just the way the story is told, and it's probably better if we just survey it very briefly again. We have Mary Magdalene. She comes to, this is in chapter 16, verse 1. This is before the long ending. Mary Magdalene and some other women come to the tomb, and the stone is already rolled away, and they encounter an angel, a young man dressed in a white robe, an angel, and he announces he has risen, Jesus has risen, and he tells them to go and tell the disciples and Peter. that he's going before you to Galilee. Now, the emphasis on Peter is sort of obvious, that because Peter was uniquely egregious in his denials of Jesus in the courtyard of the high priest while Jesus is being interrogated and tortured, Peter is denying he has ever known Jesus, certainly denying that he's a disciple. So that emphasis on Peter makes sure, God, in other words, from Peter's perspective, the idea is he's going to get word that an angel sent the women to inform them, and wanted Peter especially to know this, that Jesus has been raised from the dead. And obviously this is important information for Peter as part of his restoration. So the emphasis on Peter here is not surprising. Now, does that set up an expectation that there should be more about Peter? I mean, maybe, but just mentioning him, it makes sense why it would mention him because of his denials. But do we need to have more information? Not necessarily. Matthew gives us no information about Peter's restoration, so nor does Matthew highlight Peter here specifically. So it's something that's natural here in Mark, and whether you think that sets up an expectation that there must be more information, I think that's reading too much into it. It's creating an expectation that Mark has to give us more information. I don't see why that is. It's sufficient that he's highlighted that Peter needs to know, that God wants him to know through this angel, that Jesus has been raised from the dead. All right, then then the women go out from the tomb, and they're paralyzed in one sense with astonishment and fear, and they head out. Presumably, they leave to go tell the disciples. Right? They're leaving the tomb again because the angels just told them to leave. So the act of leaving the tomb seems to be an act of fleeing the tomb and heading to the disciples. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. It says they didn't say anything to anyone, which I understand myself to be referring to them talking to other people en route. They go straight to the disciples. They're not announcing to anyone along the way that Jesus has been raised from the dead. If you don't think that's the natural way to read it, and you think that it means they didn't even go and tell the disciples, that's fine too. It's not really particularly relevant, especially to how we're going to analyze it, though I favor the first way of understanding it. Then, after that, we get something different. And what's different is we have a summary of these first two appearances. It's very concise, and it's patterned. So first, First, he appeared to Mary, and she went and told the disciples, and when they heard it, they did not believe. So that's going to create a pattern, because after those events, after these things, Jesus appeared. Again now, he appears. So this is the second appearance. And they went back and told the other disciples, and they didn't believe. So you can see it's a patterned sequence. It's created out of a mold, sort of. There's a pattern. And it's a summary. These are summaries of the two appearances. If you were to read Luke or to read Matthew, you would see a much more fulsome description of these, and of John. You'll see more fulsome descriptions of these, some of the appearances, depending on the gospel you're reading. So if we just take, for example, this one here with the two that are heading out into the country, have left Jerusalem and headed into the country, that's a huge story within Luke. But in Mark, it's just barely 2 verses. Now, this idea that Mark would be, assuming it's Mark, but that it would be very concise, where the other gospel writers have a much more fulsome account, well, that's definitely should not surprise us if we go way back to the beginning, to the account of Jesus' temptation. Look at Mark's version of the temptation. It says Jesus was in the wilderness, being tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. So that's the entire story of the temptation in Mark. It's highly concise, and it's clearly describing it without narrating it. It's describing the event, but it's not really narrating the whole event. And that's what you have here back now in chapter 16, verse 9, in the long ending. You have events which are described, they're referred to in a patterned way, but they're not being narrated in detail because Mark is trying to create this pattern. And then finally, at last, the final appearance, he appears to the 11. But now notice when he appears to the 11, we now return to your standard Markan narration. Because even though, in other words, when Jesus appears to the 11, they don't need to go run off and tell the other. There's no other. That's the 11. So they now are obviously going to believe. He rebukes them for not believing the other witnesses, but they now believe. We then have their faith here, and meaning they're going to believe. Of course, he's standing right in front of them, and we have the Great Commission that follows, and we get the description of what's going to happen as they go out into all the world. And then the final thing is Jesus is, after he had spoken to them, it says he was taken up to heaven and sat down, and they now go forth to proclaim the gospel out to the world, and Jesus is working with them as they go do it. So that's the basic, narrative structure of, or flow, however you want to describe it, the basic progression of the events, and the little change. I think that's what's important, is that we notice the change. Don't know why it's doing that. The change between these first parts here, part 1, part 2, the first appearances, and then returning to narration here. I think that's really important to notice, and that it's similar to the way Mark earlier described an event without narrating it in detail. Okay, it's also 3 appearances, and we already noticed in a previous video that this style of creating a trilogy of appearances with a pattern is similar to the story back in chapter 14, the end of part 1, with the 3 scenes there, the final scene being in Gethsemane, and that also was a trilogy in a sequence, a pattern sequence. So we already covered that in the previous video, but just to highlight it again, that that's a similar sort of narrative instinct for Mark, that he's relating these 2 events in this particular way. And I'm not trying to expound them, but there's a lot to comparing and contrasting these events, the one in the garden versus this final scene here, but I'm just passing that by in order to do other things. All right, we then have the transition that we have to cover. What is the transition? The transition goes here in after the women have left the tomb. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. We then have the beginning here of a summary of the post-resurrection appearances. And it will sort of, regardless of whatever you think happened with the women, it does here say that Mary actually went after Jesus appeared to her and told those who had been with him. So, in other words, what the angel instructed the women to do here, go tell the disciples and Peter, we're told in verse 10 that does get fulfilled. But it took the Lord appearing to Mary in order for it to be fulfilled. So whether you think that's resolving their inability to go right away, or whether it's simply an appearance story, it's either way, it's a natural progression is the point. That's what we expect after verse 8, is for there to be the announcement to the disciples that he is raised from the dead, and we do get that, though the whole structure of what's going on in the narrative is a little different. All right, then we have to look at verse 9 more specifically. The opening of verse 9 is a "the," which I'll come back to, but that's introducing a new episode in Mark. There's other places in Mark where he does this. And I'm really interested in this word for resurrection, anastasis, the word used other places in Mark, of course, for resurrection. But what's interesting is that it's been put into the participial form. It's a circumstantial participle for those of you who know Greek. And the word appeared, ephani, is the main verb. Now, why did the writer, why would Mark have put this into a participle? Well, it's because this information here is repeated information. We already know that he's been raised from the dead, right? We were told up here he was raised from the dead. So as Mark is telling the reader about the appearances, he doesn't need to state that Jesus is raised from the dead as if the reader doesn't know he's raised from the dead. But when he repeats it, the repetition of the information is not as important in this clause. The main focus is going to be on the main action, Jesus' appearance, because that's going to become the motif in these in this trilogy of stories. So the resurrection gets subordinated into a circumstantial participle. We have the same thing here in chapter 6, where we see that this is right after the feeding the 5,000, when he's going to send his disciples across the sea, and then he'll join them later in the night, come walking on the water. It says immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. All right. And then the next statement is going to be that he went up on the mountain to pray. That's going to be the next main action. But we get a repeat of this information here. It says, and having bidden them farewell. Well, we were just told he's going to dismiss the crowd. So we're repeating what we sort of already know is going to happen. He's going to take leave of the crowd, apotaxamenos. And when he does that, it's in a participial form. Okay? Aorist participle. This action happens before this next main action. All right? So in other words, this is just the natural way to transition when you're repeating information that's known. So that's what's happening up here. The resurrection is already known. And so when you repeat that information, you as just introducing this summary of the post-resurrection appearances, you use anastas, the aorist participle, before the main verb appeared. But then that depends upon this up here. This has to be connected to the fact that we already know he's raised, which we do according to verse 6. All right, so that's the first element in the transition that indicates that our writer is connecting verse 9 back to verses 1 to 8. Then we have another element, which is the chronological marker. Right here, we're told, let's maybe clean this up just a little bit, just to get some of the stuff out of the way. We're told that he appeared in the morning on the first day of the week. Now, some have really had a problem with this. They say, why is Mark repeating the chronological marker we already know? Because it said up here that the women came very early. That is, early is the word proi in Greek, meaning in the morning. Early is fine, but on the first day of the week. So we have here the word very early. Leon, proi, which is, again, this is Greek for very early in the morning. And Leon is just an adverb there, meaning very early in the morning. Here, it seems like it's just repeated information. Why would we repeat this information in the morning on the first day of the week? Well, first of all, if you go to John's Gospel, notice that John also does this. He says, on the first day of the week, Mary came to the tomb, and then later here in chapter 19, it says, on the first day of the week, when it was evening that day, Jesus appeared to the disciples. So John repeats this expression, the first day of the week, as well. You can see it there. I think that was verse 19, and you can see it here in verse 1. So it's obviously not completely and utterly unique to Mark, the idea that you might repeat the timestamp. But the key thing, just like in John, so in Mark, why would you repeat the timestamp? And the reason you would repeat it is because it's a new event, and so you don't know if this appearance is at the same time as the other events. But we just don't know. And so because this is going to be the first appearance, the reader doesn't, it could have been the next day or something. So we get repeated information. in order to tell us it is also on the first day of the week in the morning. But notice the subtlety here. First of all, that Leon, the adverb Leon, that's the same word as this one. I hope you can see it right here, that has been dropped because it's not very early in the morning anymore. They came to the tomb very early in the morning, yes, but now the appearance to Mary is in the morning. It's still proi, it's still early, it's still in the morning, but it's not, it could have been at 9 in the morning. It's not, at dawn, which is what Leon implies. It's at the very break of the morning. So that's been dropped. And why has that been dropped? Because the appearance would obviously have to be after Mary first came to the tomb. Jesus didn't appear to her at the tomb, according to verses 1 to 8 up here. He appeared to her, but not then. She wouldn't need to be at the tomb wondering where his body is, or rather coming to, anoint his body and stuff if she already knew he was raised from the dead. So this is a subtle indicator that verse 9 has been written with verses 1 to 8 in mind. And I should point out that in some of the translations, they choose to put this timestamp, this chronological marker, with the verb, the participle, anastas, that he rose on the first day of the week in the morning. But I think it's more natural since it follows the participle and it precedes the main verb. And Mark's default is usually to put the timestamp first, before the verb he's referring to, that it refers to, the action. So that would be one reason why I'd be inclined to take it next, but also just sort of common sense that since we've got other indicators that this is written in light of verses 1 to 8, like the dropping of Leon and the circumstantial participalizing of Anastas, the resurrection, I think it's more likely to take that way. And by the way, Eusebius also describes it this way. Some of the translations, like the Net Bible or the CSB, they do it the way I have it here. Other translations, like the ESV, are more like this. They put it with the resurrection, and I simply disagree with them. It's not the end of it's not the key to the whole argument, but I just don't think that's the most likely way that we should read it, given that the story is going to give plenty of evidence of being deliberately written to culminate verses 1 to 8. And now we're just looking at the transition, seeing that the transition itself is very carefully written to move us from verse 8 to verse 9. This is the point, that yes, there's some abruptness. I don't disagree with that. But Mark is abrupt. This is hardly the only place where Mark will be abrupt in his transitions in his gospel. But I wouldn't say it's disjunctive. There is a normal transition. It's concise, it's subtle, but it is carefully written to transition us out of verse 8 into verses 9 to 11. All right, and the first appearance. So that's the transition. Now we need to cover the thought flow. What is the thought flow as we go through from chapters 14, 15 into 16? Well, the first thing is that people have pointed out, and it's something that I myself held for many, many years, as one of the major reasons why it didn't seem to me like it worked very well, this long ending, and it's because there's no meeting in Galilee. We are told in chapter 14 that Jesus tells his disciples they're going to meet him after he's raised from the dead. He'll meet them in Galilee. And then we also learned right here, he says, the angel says, go tell the disciples he's going before you to Galilee. He's now raised from the dead. This is chapter 16, go and meet him in Galilee. So we have two references that Jesus is going to meet them after his resurrection in Galilee. So why is there no meeting in Galilee? There's no meeting in Galilee in the long ending. And that always seemed like a really big gaping hole. Now, by the way, people who think the gospel ends, most scholars think the gospel was intentionally ended at verse 8. That's probably the more common view now. But for those scholars who hold that view, obviously they also don't have any meeting in Galilee. They have to believe Mark set up a meeting in Galilee, and then that's it. There's nothing. There's no meeting in Galilee. So I guess for them it wouldn't be a basis for rejecting the long ending, since they don't have a meeting in Galilee either. But I think this is all explained, and I'm somewhat embarrassed that I didn't notice it before, if I'm being honest. So what happens is that we have Jesus appears to Mary, and she goes and tells the other disciples, those that had been with him, that he's alive. What does he do then? Or what do they do? Well, they don't believe. They did not believe it. And now you have to think, if they didn't believe that he was raised from the dead, okay, they were told that he's going to rise from the dead and then he'll meet them in Galilee. But now we're told they don't believe that he's actually raised from the dead. So my question is, why? Why would they go to Galilee to meet him? They obviously wouldn't. There's no basis for going because they don't believe he's been raised from the dead. How about the next story? They didn't believe again, and therefore they don't go to Galilee. There's no need to go to Galilee. There's not going to be a meeting in Galilee with the resurrected Jesus if they don't believe he's raised from the dead. So then what happens is Jesus appeared directly to the 11. Now they're not in Galilee, they're still in Jerusalem. Now it doesn't say it, of course, but it's how Luke understood it and how John understands it, because they both record the first appearance to the disciples as being in Jerusalem. And of course it's in Jerusalem. Why would it be in Galilee? Because they don't believe that he was raised from the dead. So they're going to still be in Jerusalem. And so he appears to them in Jerusalem, and he shows them that he's alive. Now I want to ask you a question, which is, what's the importance of Galilee in the story? What is the importance of Galilee? Well, the importance is that the disciples, once they believe that he's raised from the dead, they can then meet him in Galilee. But then that implies they have to know that he's been raised from the dead, and others have to tell them. So the whole framework of Galilee was that the disciples wouldn't have directly known that Jesus was raised from the dead, but instead he would appear to others. They would inform the disciples, and he's given the disciples instructions ahead of time that once they hear that he is raised from the dead, they can travel to Galilee, and there they will meet him. Okay, that's what's implied in the instructions about Galilee. But Galilee is just a launching pad. If you are in chapter 13, we know that Jesus is going out into the gospel, has to go out to the whole world. That's the messianic program, that he's going to die, he's going to rise from the dead, and then the disciples are going to carry his mission out to the whole world and face persecution and so on. That's all described in chapter 13. It's repeated in chapter 14. The gospel is going to go forth out to all the world. That's the messianic program, after all. And we know that Galilee is not the goal. Galilee is not an end in itself. It's not as though that's the climax of the gospel, is this meeting in Galilee. Galilee is just the disciples now know he's raised from the dead. They go to meet him. Okay? They have opportunity to believe his own predictions as well as the words of the other witnesses who've seen him. Once they get to Galilee, we know what's going to happen in Galilee. He's going to send them out all around the world. That's what we expect if we're reading the earlier parts of the gospel. That's the true anticipation of what you would expect from the culmination of the gospel. So what happens is, once he appears to them here, and they now know that he is alive, Galilee is now sort of irrelevant. They were derelict in their faith. They did not believe, and therefore they didn't go to Galilee. But now they know he's alive. They know he's raised from the dead. So Mark jumps right immediately to the Great Commission. And Jesus launches the disciples forth on the Great Commission. Now, does this happen in Jerusalem or does it happen in Galilee? It's irrelevant at this point. At this point, it's irrelevant. All that matters is they now know he's raised from the dead. But the only reason they know is because he had to appear directly for them. In other words, Mark explains why they didn't go to Galilee before Jesus appeared to them. Because they didn't believe the other witnesses, and they didn't obviously believe what Jesus had said beforehand. So when he shows up, he rebukes them for not believing the witness of the other disciples. And look at the things that Jesus did to help them. This is part of the emphasis in Mark's story. He appeared to Mary. Well, why did he appear to Mary? He appeared to Mary because she was the one from whom Jesus had cast out the 7 demons. Now, this is a unique Markan emphasis. Earlier in the gospel, whenever demoniacs spoke up about Jesus, even if they were saying the truth, Jesus silenced them. He muzzled them because they are not reliable witnesses. So he muzzles them. He silences them. He doesn't want people to take their witness as the truth of anything. It doesn't matter if sometimes they say the truth. So he rejects the witness of the demoniacs. He wants everybody to reject the witness of the demoniacs. But once someone has been exorcised of demons and they have been delivered from their captivity and from the power of the demon, now that person is a uniquely powerful witness. And we see that, first of all, in that Jesus never exorcised people from announcing who he was. They could, once the demon was exorcised, the person with their mouth now liberated could freely speak as a witness to Jesus. And in fact, he famously sends the demoniac who was possessed with legion in Mark chapter 5 back to his home city and village and the surrounding area as a witness to proclaim about Jesus. So once a person has been exorcised of demons, they serve as a uniquely powerful, credible witness to the work of Jesus and to the truth about Jesus. And so Mark adds this detail about Mary for the first time in the book. There's been other references to Mary, but he specifically highlights the background of her story to show that the disciples not believing is unjustified within the context of Mark. And then the next 2 disciples, the ones that are heading out into the country, the emphasis is that they have left the city. They have gone away from Jerusalem, away from the disciples. We know from Luke, of course, the very act shows that they've abandoned their hope that Jesus was the Messiah. He's now dead, and the disciples are all mourning here. They're mourning, and so these disciples have abandoned their convictions about Jesus, and they have left Jerusalem city and gone out into the countryside, no doubt to return to their home village. Luke elaborates on this much more in more detail, that's what's happening. Mark simply hints at it by the fact that they've left the city and left the disciples and headed out. But now they've come back. What would explain that they've come back? They left convinced that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. That's why they've left. But now they're back. So that provides extra power, you see. What would have been the thing? What would it take to get these guys to come back to the disciples in Jerusalem? Well, it took the appearance of Jesus showing them that he was raised from the dead. So again, it's unjustified. That's the point. The disciples don't believe, and they should have believed, and therefore Jesus rebukes them. And then once they now believe, he commissions them to go forth on their mission. Now, why on the Great Commission? Why is not the Great Commission, on their mission to the world? Why would this be important to Mark's readers? Well, because they're part of the Great Commission. They're trying to expand the gospel out to the world as well in their area. And to be sure, few of them would claim to have seen Jesus raised from the dead and is the risen Jesus. Not many would have claimed that. Maybe there were still some alive, but not many would have claimed that. The majority of people who believed Jesus was the Messiah, believed he was raised from the dead, were like the disciples. When they had been told by reliable witnesses that he had been raised from the dead, but they didn't believe it. And so Jesus shows up and rebukes them. You see, it's unjustified to reject the witness of reliable disciples, reliable witnesses. So for Mark's readers, that's relevant because many of them wouldn't have actually seen Jesus. And then, did the disciples' unbelief halt the gospel? Did it cripple the messianic program to bring the gospel out to the whole world? No. The grand announcement was going to go forth to the whole world. Why? Because regardless of whether the disciples are derelict or not, Jesus will act and secure their faith, shore up their faith, bolster it, so that in the end the commission is fulfilled. And indeed, at the end, they end up going forth confidently and making proclamation of the gospel everywhere, and the Lord is working with them. He will be with them in order to secure that it happen. And you can see why this would be relevant to Mark's readers, that they have this same encouragement. So this is the... I should have added, too, that this idea that they're... proclaim the gospel. I should have highlighted the word gospel here. That, remember, the opening verse of the Gospel of Mark is the beginning of the gospel, the beginning of the grand announcement of Jesus the King, the Messiah. And so here, the going forth of the gospel out to the whole world is obviously a thematic culmination or climax to the book. The disciples are now going to expand the mission out to the whole world, and Jesus will ascend and be enthroned, sit down, enthroned, because he is, enthroned at the right hand of God. Why? Because he is the Messiah. He is the King. The word Messiah, Mashiach, means the anointed King. So the King then takes his seat. So all this then is a natural, logical culmination to the Gospel of Mark, going all the way back to chapter 1, verse 1, with Mark's unique themes and with the thought flow of the story accounting for why the Galilee meeting and why they failed to meet Jesus in Galilee, and the emphasis on how that didn't cripple the program. Jesus would do what was needed to bolster their faith, even if he had to directly appear to them in Jerusalem, to provoke their faith and their confidence, so that they might ultimately complete the mission that he's ascending them on. Okay? So all that is to show how the thought flow of the long ending is the natural culmination to the gospel and the natural culmination to that subplot about Galilee and their dereliction of faith. It's part of the main focus. By the way, it's a main focus in Mark's gospel, the disciples' dereliction. There's numerous places distinctive in Mark where Jesus rebukes the disciples. He questions why they don't believe, why are they hard-hearted, and so on. Why aren't they understanding what he's saying? It's a unique emphasis that is originally in Mark. So that's another confirmation that we're dealing with something written by the original author. So we've covered the basic story structure. We've covered the transition in verse 9. We've covered the thought flow throughout the whole gospel to get to this culmination. And now we need to look at the what do we need to look at? We need to look at the vocabulary and the syntax. And you could spend all day doing this. We are not going to do that. We'll just highlight some of the key ideas in the grammar, in the vocabulary first, and then in the syntax. All right. So let's start with the word agron here, let's start here with those who had been with him. Those who had been with him. This expression is distinctive within Mark. It's not distinctive, I guess yes, we'll say it's distinctive. Mark uses it the most to describe the disciples. Very famously, he uses it in chapter 3. The very first time Jesus appoints the 12, it says he appointed them so that they might be with him and that he might send them forth to make proclamation. So that's an expression that is distinctive in Mark, and it comes up here. In other words, you might have thought if someone else wrote it, they would have just said she went and told the 11 or told the disciples. But that's not what it says. It uses a description that's unique to Mark. This emphasis that the disciples are the ones who are with him, that he has appointed to be with him. And so the fact that that gets used here is one of those subtleties that indicates it's the same hand as the one that wrote chapter 3. The use of the word agron here, the word for country, really means countryside. Now, the word is used, of course, by all the evangelists, but in Mark it's used in a way that no other evangelist uses it, and Mark does this twice. When Simon comes, the one that they're going to lay the cross on him, it says that he came in apo tu agru. He came from the countryside into Jerusalem, and then they grabbed him and laid Jesus' cross on him. But that idea that you have the city of Jerusalem, and on the outside of the city is the countryside, that use of the countryside outside of Jerusalem is used only in Mark, and then of course in the shared material where they copy Mark. Then you also have it here in the long ending. So it's in chapter 15, and then it's here again in chapter 16. But yeah, Mark is the only one who uses the word like that to describe the countryside around Jerusalem as agros. Then you have apistia and sclerocardia, the word for unbelief and the word for hardness of heart. So these words, again, are unique to Mark. And when I say unique, I mean Mark uses them. And let's see, Matthew does use sclerocardia, but only where he lifts his line directly from Mark. It's just shared material. So that's unique. And then apistia as well. You only see that in Mark, except I think there's one place where there's shared material. Now, Luke never uses sclerocardia, but Matthew does, but it's only in shared material. So so these are words that are coming from Mark. Only Mark uses them, unless it's shared material. And then ktesis. Now, this is unique to Mark, and none of the other writers, Luke and Matthew, nor John, they never use the word ktesis at all. Mark uses it 3 times in his gospel, and so 2 other times it comes up here to describe the whole of creation, ktesis. So there you have another example where it's unique to Mark, but it's not even in shared material. And then we have the sick, laying hands on the sick, arostos. Again, Mark uses this a few times in his gospel. It's never used in Luke. It's used once in Matthew, but only in shared material, where in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, Matthew lifts his phrase, ke etherapevsen tus arostus, from Mark chapter 6, also the setting of the feeding of the 5,000. Those of you who know Greek, you can go look at that. So you have that. And then as a matter of syntax, just a subtlety in syntax, is the metato plus the infinitive. Again, that's just a way of describing like after an action has taken place. And Mark uses this expression a few times in his gospel. Matthew never uses it except once in shared material. He lifts it from Mark. He doesn't use it on his own. It's not his style. And then Luke does, I think once he uses this expression, but Mark uses it the most. But nonetheless, it's a trait of Mark. It's a characteristic. You wouldn't say it's just utterly unique to Mark, and it's certainly not. It's not super common in the New Testament, but I mean, it's a totally common Greek expression. There's nothing special about it. It's just to point out that it's certainly an expression Mark uses, is characteristic. He uses a few times, and here it is in the long ending. Now, what I would want to point out, if we just take a look at this, we kind of shrink it and look, is notice that all of these expressions are in, I can't quite get it all on the screen, they're distributed. That's what I want to point out. They're distributed, right? If you look, you can see they're distributed throughout this whole section. It's not just in like one verse. These are subtleties that are, the vocabulary is, these aren't, like some of these expressions, it's not just that Mark uses them, it's that they're part of his major theme. I mean, the unbelief and the hard-heartedness of the disciples is a major pattern or theme within the gospel. And the disciples being described as those who had been with him is a unique expression. When Matthew and Luke tell the story of the appointment of the apostles, they don't include that phrase at all. It's only in Mark. And it becomes something that Mark uses. The demoniac in Mark 5, he wants, after he's exercised of the legion, it says he asked that he could be with him, with Jesus. So again, this is something that's a theme that's a focus in Mark. It's subtle. It's not super prominent, that element, and yet here it comes up in the long ending. So the fact that and then of course the word ktesis, and orostu. So the fact that this vocabulary is distributed throughout the long ending suggests that it's just simply in the mind of the writer. This is the vocabulary that naturally comes to his mind, and it's exactly the kind of words we see from Mark. Now, there's many other words, by the way, that Mark uses. There's many other vocabulary words in this long ending that Mark uses. What I'm trying to point out is not just mundane words that are used in all the Gospels, but some of the vocabulary that's unique to Mark, unique to his emphases and his themes that turn up in a distributed way throughout the long ending. That strongly indicates to me that we have the hand of Mark, especially when you add it to the structural issues and the transition in verse 9 and the very way the story is constructed as a trilogy and so on. It's just a lot of evidence that we have the same hand of the same author that wrote it. Now, what about counter evidence? Well, there is some counter evidence for sure. Let's look at the first one, which is the use of the. It's been pointed out that Mark uses the. That's a conjunction, meaning like now or and or but, in the closing of the long ending more than he does normally, because his favored conjunction is ke, which means and. Mark has that strong paratactic staccato effect as you read his book, and Jesus did this, and then he went here, and then they did this, and then and. That's true. Mark does that. But in chapters 10 to 16, there's 160 some odd uses of the word the, of this word in the gospel. And what happens is, if you've just read the first 9 chapters, the is used more sparingly. But in the final 6 chapters, I think it's something like 70%, I did the math, it's 68 or something like that, percent of all the uses of the are concentrated at the end of the gospel. So though it's true that scholars point out this is Mark's habit to use ke, he also uses the quite a bit, particularly in the final chapters. And by the way, he does use the ke as well, just to show you I just picked one where you might have expected Mark could have used a the here in verse 11, but he chose ke. And then there's many other ke. I mean, there's a good distribution of this conjunction ke throughout here. I just didn't highlight them, but that would be normal, so I didn't highlight anything about it. It's the use of the concentration. But let's just take a look at one other story real quick. If you look at this story, this is the story of Barabbas. It's where Pilate is trying to get Jesus released through Barabbas. This is a self-contained episode, right? It has its own beginning, middle, and end. Is the sort of the episode involving Barabbas, and it begins with a the because it's introducing a new episode, and we're told that it's at the feast, and this was the tradition that they would release someone, and then there's another the right there. We're told by way of introducing Barabbas, it's new information, so we have another the to introduce it, and then we get a series of these the as we switch back and forth between speakers. And then the final one, which is the conclusion of Pilate, where he draws his conclusion that they're not going to accept Barabbas, okay? And so you get sort of a summary at the end that's introduced by the. So what I'm pointing out is that you get a high concentration of the conjunction the with different uses. These uses here are different. These are just change of speaker uses compared to the other ones. But anyway, that's very variable uses of the concentrated in one story. It's a single episode, rather, with its own beginning, middle, and end. It's a natural paragraph, in other words. So if we go back up here, well, so is the long ending. And it's its own natural story. But all these uses are typical of Mark. So if you look at, I went too far. If you look at this one, for example, here, the reason that exists there is because you have a men de construction. These two words go together. And Mark does this other places in his gospel. That's totally normal. This the here is a saying, separating the saying into 2 parts. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. That's a perfectly Markan way to use a the. To introduce a saying or to divide the saying into 2 parts. And then these are just like the ones we just looked at in the story of Barabbas. or you're introducing two separate episodes. So these are perfectly normal ways of using the. I find this just totally unconvincing, that the idea that Mark couldn't have written this. It's actually perfectly consistent with how he did the Barabbas story. Now, there's one other thing, which is the use of ekinos. This in English would be that. It's a demonstrative pronoun. And it means, in this case, it's used substantively, so it means that person. It's being used like a noun, in other words. And we see that come up right away with you have the reference to Mary as she, or that girl. They, the reference to the disciples, another one there. And then you get one more down here at the end of the story, they. Now, this is definitely different, meaning Mark does not normally use the demonstrative pronoun ekinos. He'll use the other demonstrative pronoun, utos, but he doesn't usually use the ekinos like this. Okay, so this is definitely not what you would expect if you had read the rest of the gospel, and it stands out as being different. So let's go look at another story where this is the planting of the vineyard, where it's a parable, and the man, when the fruit comes in, he wants to send his servant to the tenants to get fruit from the vineyard, and they took him and they beat him. And in Greek, this is the word afton. Okay, it's not ekinon, it's afton. Afton means him. It's the normal word for the personal pronoun. But then it says he sent again another servant. And now when it says they struck him, it's not afton, it switches to ekinon. Now maybe that's explained because it's not the earlier servant, but you really don't need to say that. You can just say afton. It would make sense because we already know it's another servant. So it's totally natural to switch to ekinon, but it's not required. And there are other places where Mark doesn't do that, as we're going to see. And then he does it again here, that he sent another servant, and then him. Notice it's not afton, it's ekinon. It's like this one here. So Mark is switching to the substantive use of ekinos, but he really didn't, it's not the way he would normally write it, but he does do it in this story here in chapter 12. And then he speaks of those servants. There's another reference to ekinis there. It should be a sigma there. Ekinis. But look at this. It says at the end here, it says, he has a beloved son, and he says, surely they'll respect my son. And so he sent him, and him they killed. And once again, we go back to afton. But why? There's not just a simple explanation for this, I don't think, grammatically, why Mark is suddenly jumping into the use of ekinon versus afton in all these instances. I would be very interested to hear, if anybody thinks they know why, I would be interested to hear your explanation for what explains Mark's sudden shift into using ekinos as a substantive, which he normally doesn't use in the gospel. Why is it suddenly turning? Now, he uses the word ekinos a few times, but not as a substantive, except in that parable, which is a series of successive sending the servants. And then here in the trilogy of appearances at the end, he suddenly uses ekinos or ekini. And I don't really have a great explanation any more than I do for the one in 12. So that's not going to be the basis. As far as I'm concerned, that can't be the basis for deciding that Mark couldn't have written it. So there we have it, a variety of reasons in terms of the way in which it's structured as a patterned trilogy, its concision, the way it describes these appearances in summary, concise fashion, like the temptation, the thought flow, the narrative explained about why Galilee drops out of the story, why that's not interesting to Mark once the disciples prove derelict, which is the major focus of the narrative, and the culmination of the gospel, that he's exalted and enthroned, and the gospel goes forth out to the world, just as chapter 1, verse 1 is the beginning of that story, so the chapter 16, verse 19 and 20 is the end of that story. And then the unique vocabulary, that some of it very subtle, very unique to Mark's emphases and focus in the whole gospel. coming up, distributed throughout the long ending, as well as some syntax with the use of the and the meta plus the infinitive. Just to summarize all of this, this is a significant amount of evidence on top of the other evidence we had that the same Markan hand has composed this, has written it as the original culmination of his gospel. In the final video, we'll look at the external evidence. I hope this was helpful. I look forward to critiques from people, particularly those who are familiar with the evidence from the work of Kelhoffer or Farmer or some of the other writers, scholars who have looked at this in much greater detail than I did. I didn't deliberately go through and try and refute everything they said. I tried to capture the main reasons why I don't agree with their conclusions. So I hope this was helpful.